Hello BookTube! Welcome to our first installment of your daily Oxford. This is where we go on a book-by-book tour of my Oxford World Classics. And today we are going to be talking about Arrian and the campaigns of Alexander the Great. I'm joking around a little bit. If you haven't been watching Steve Donahue's terrific series on his Penguin Classics, I highly recommend it. If there's a slight chance that you're watching one of my videos and you're not watching one of Steve Donahue's, I cannot recommend it enough. But a day or two ago, he did a video, one of his daily penguins, on Arrian, who is from what I understand, a third-rate hack historian. And in a moment of confusion reading the title, I got all excited because I thought it was going to be a video on Arrian, who is not a third-rate hack. And Steve Donahue made a little joke about it, and sort of a bait and switch. He did a video today on Quintus Curtis Rufus. It's someone I haven't read. I've already pre-ordered it, and I will be reading it. And it's someone that wrote another biography on Alexander the Great. So I'll talk a little bit about Arrian and Alexander the Great. The way I came across this book was sort of like a confluence of circumstances. Everything sort of circled around until I came to this book. So for one, I had already been reading a lot of Plutarch, and Plutarch just has a wealth of biographies, and one of which is Alexander the Great. I have a great little slim volume. This is also translated by John Dryden, and it's more of a fantastical portrait of Alexander the Great instead of a history of his campaigns. It goes through his life, but it's more about the man, in my opinion, and it's terrific. I love it, but it's not as historically detailed as you would imagine a history book to be. It's just not that. Now, Arrian, I came across or learned about through Epictetus, who I just recently talked about in one of my recent videos. From what I understand, the writings of Epictetus came to us now because Arrian was the transcriber of Epictetus's doctrines. That's sort of how I understand it. And so these two things came together, and I have this terrific biography by Plutarch on Alexander the Great, and then Arrian, who I found through Epictetus, has a biography of or history of the campaigns of Alexander the Great. I was very interested in reading it. And to me, this is much more of a proper history book, with one kind of major caveat, is that it's sort of history fan fiction, and the very few things that I've read of Alexander the Great always kind of come back to that. Everyone that wrote about him that we have now idolized him. So we have this romantic figure. Uh, Arrian did criticize him slightly, but for the most part, not really. It's sort of the equivalent of like writing about a fan writing about Elvis Presley or something. Everybody loves Alexander the Great, and I've bookmarked a couple things. I'll just try to read through them very quickly. Let's see, where is it? The story goes that Alexander called Achilles fortunate to have Homer as the herald of his lasting fame. Indeed, Alexander had good reasons to envy Achilles' fortune in this respect. For all his other successes, this one field was left vacant, and his achievements were not published to the world as they deserved, either in verse or in any verse composition. And I think it's such an interesting position Alexander the Great found himself in our general knowledge of history. Because to have this incredibly mythical, larger-than-life, hugely influential figure, and then to not have the great literary work that corresponds with it. So there's, Odysseus in the Odyssey, or Achilles mentioned here, or you find even Napoleon in great literary works. Caesar, of course. We don't have it. And then with that, we also don't have very many first-hand historical documents of Alexander the Great either. And then meanwhile, everybody knows who Alexander the Great is. And I don't really quite understand how, I knew who Alexander the Great was probably in elementary school. I didn't know who Achilles was, or Odysseus, or Napoleon, or maybe Napoleon, but I knew Alexander the Great. He's the man that took over the world, the known world, marched through the whole world, took it over. What else did I'll give you an idea of some of the idolizing. Some of this is so good. Let's see. So, Alexander the Great, he was remarkably skillful in intuiting the right tactic when it was still far from self-evident, and remarkably successful at predicting the likely course of events once the initial evidence was to hand. In the management of the army, deployment in battle, supply of army and equipment, his expertise was masterly, and he had an extraordinary natural gift for lifting the morale of his troops, inspiring them with confidence and banishing their fears in times of danger by the example of his own fearlessness. And then, anyone who vilifies Alexander should not just cite those actions which do not deserve censure, but take an overall view of the entire course of Alexander's career. If he then still wants to criticize, he should first make some comparisons and reflect on them. Who is he, and what has he achieved to assume the right to vilify a man of the stature who reached the height of human success and made himself unambiguously king of 2 continents, with the name spread throughout the world? By comparison, the critic is an insignificant figure toiling away at some insignificant work, and not even a master of that. It's a fan. This is what loves Alexander the Great, and it's such a weird situation because if we knew less, we would probably know nothing. But that's not entirely true. But if we knew more, he would be a more complicated figure. He would be a flawed figure. He wouldn't be this mythological hero that we know of today. Of course, it would always be better to know more, but nearly anyone that in the Western world, if you bring up Alexander the Great, it's truly you're talking about a comparison or to glory. The positive idea of world domination. There's no other figure who took over the world that we look at as a hero. So, anyway, one last thing. I know I'm running a little bit long. I do want to mention Diogenes. He was a Greek cynic and had all sorts of... Diogenes would do well on Twitter, I'll put it that way. So this was Alexander the Great meeting Diogenes for the first time. As he was sunning himself, Alexander stood over him and said, "Ask whatever you wish of me." And Diogenes replied, "Stand out of my light." So Diogenes is laying out, sunning himself, and when Alexander walked over, he cast a shadow over Diogenes' body, and he asked him to move out of my way. This is the man that's taking over the world. So I'll end there. This is our first daily Oxford. Leave a comment if you would like. It's a little scattered, but well. Thank you. Bye.